Hello and welcome to the next in the series of Central Equine's Ask the Vet. I'm Rebecca, one of the vets, and today I will be answering some of your questions on worming. So first I thought I would just touch on why it's important to worm egg count your horses as opposed to just worming as and when. So the main reason for this is resistance to the medications that we use to worm horses is developing. And if we continue to just use wormers and not act and become a little bit clever about the way that we go about this, then at some point you may well be in the position where wormers just don't work anymore. So you may well have heard the figure that about 80% of the worms live in about 20% of the horses. So if you worm egg count a large herd of horses, then you'll generally find, as long as management strategies are effective, you'll only needing to be worming a couple of them. Exactly why this is, we don't know, but a small proportion of horses just seem to be incredibly susceptible to worms, and no matter what you do, they'll always find them and pick them up. But if you're only having to worm those few horses and you can leave the rest alone, that is the best thing that you can do in terms of helping to prevent resistance from developing, so that we have wormers available for as long as possible. The first question that came in asked how often worm egg counts should be performed. We advise doing your first test early spring, so March time, and then regularly testing throughout the summer between every 8 and 12 weeks. This generally means that you end up doing kind of 3 or 4 tests throughout the kind of spring, summer, autumn period, and this allows us to see whether or not your horse is picking up any worm eggs, seeing whether or not they're being exposed, and advising you to treat as soon as we notice this, to hopefully prevent any adverse effects from occurring. Someone else has also asked what worms are tested for using a worm egg count. So the main egg that we see is called a strong-gall egg, and that is an egg produced by redworms. So most of the time when we tell you your egg per gram value, that will be strong-gall eggs. In young horses, we do occasionally see ascarid eggs, but that does tend to only be in young horses, so kind of 1, 2, maybe 3-year-olds, and past this point we don't really see horses affected by them. So that may be something that you get back if you have young horses, but otherwise it'll mainly be strong-gall eggs that we're referring to when we say eggs per gram. Because of this, tapeworm is one that we cannot see on a worm egg count. The eggs of a tapeworm are shed in the segments, and so if you see tapeworm segments in your horse's poo, then you will know that you definitely need to worm for tapeworm. However, otherwise you can order a kit online and you can test your horse's saliva for antibodies against tapeworms. If it comes back as high or positive, then they need worming for tapeworm. If you feel that that's not something that you'd be able to do, then there is also a blood test available that we can come out and do, and then we'd be able to advise you further as to whether or not your horse needs worming for tapeworm as well. Another question we had in is what are encysted redworms? So encysted redworms are one of the larval stages of the redworm life cycle. So the larvae in the gut burrow into the gut wall and undergo a development stage there. Sometimes they will just re-emerge, so as soon as they've undergone development, they will come straight back out and carry on their life cycle. However, sometimes if the conditions outside aren't favourable for them, then they will encyst. So that means that they just kind of go to sleep in that gut wall and wait there until conditions are better. This typically happens in late autumn, early winter, and then when the conditions are more favourable, it's early spring, so that's when they re-emerge. It's this re-emergence that can cause a life-threatening disease called larval cyatostominosis. So if there are lots of encysted redworm in your horse's gut lining and they all emerge at once, this can cause massive damage to your horse's gut and can cause them to develop diarrhea, colic, weight loss. Sometimes they'll get a plaque of ventral edema, which is a swelling underneath your horse's belly. And if you notice any of these things, then it is very important that you call us as soon as possible, as if there is severe damage to your horse's gut, then they do quite often need hospitalisation, and we do in fact lose horses to this condition if they aren't given treatment quick enough. The treatment for encysted redworm is a drug called moxidectin or Equest, and you can also use a 5-day course of Panacur. However, resistance is developing to these drugs, especially the Panacur, and its treatment failure has been started to be noted against these. Therefore, it's very important that you don't just use Equest as your general wormer. It should be used only for when you're wanting to treat for the encysted redworm in the winter, and at other times of the year you should be using something else. In order to help prevent your horse ever becoming ill with encysted redworm, you can make sure that you're regularly worm egg counting throughout the summer. You can make sure that your management strategy against worms are all in place, and this should mean that your horse doesn't have a high burden going into the winter, so hopefully shouldn't have a high burden of encysted redworm. The last question was asking how to prevent horses from getting worms. So this is probably the best thing that you can do, and something that is very easily done. Poo picking is the mainstay, so you need to be doing this at least twice a week. If you can do it more frequently, or if you do it more frequently, that is great, but twice a week is the minimum in order to be effective at reducing the worm burden on the pasture. And then once you have your wheelbarrow full of poo, you then need to be taking that and removing it from the fields where your horses graze. There is little point in just tipping it at the edge, because in favourable conditions it has been seen that worms can migrate several metres, so they can migrate back into the middle of the pasture and then potentially be eaten again by your horses, just repeating that life cycle over again. So make sure when you've got your wheelbarrow full of dung, you take it away, put it in a muck heap in a trailer far away, where it can be rotted down separately, so that your hard work isn't wasted. Stocking density of fields is another key factor to consider. So if your field, I understand what it's like, there's not always a lot of field space. So if your fields are particularly busy, that's where you really need to be on it with poo picking. Twice a week in those cases probably aren't enough. You need to be trying to do it every single day, just to try and minimise the amount of poo on that pasture, and so then minimise the number of worm eggs that are going to be there. Another strategy you can use is co-grazing. So this is where you, after your horses have grazed a pasture, you then move either sheep or cows onto that field. They will then eat the worm eggs and they don't get affected by them. So they essentially hoover them up, clean your pasture for you, and then obviously after it's undergone a period of rest, so the grass to regrow, your horse can go back out onto that pasture, and it should have a lower number of worm eggs than when we first started. And then finally, a little point in and amongst this is, if you have a new horse coming onto your yard, our advice would be to worm them with an Equest Premox, and then keep them stabled for 3 days afterwards. After this point, they can then go out into an isolation paddock, and we would advise doing a worm egg count 10 to 14 days after they were given the wormer. Hopefully this will come back at 0, the worming was effective, and then they are free to go out with the rest of the herd. However, if this isn't 0, if the number comes back as high, then that is a concern, because that could mean that there is resistance to moxidectin in these worms, and the last thing you want to be doing is turning that horse out on pasture with the rest of your herd, spreading resistance around. So in that case, we would advise giving us a call, and we can help advise you as the best thing to do. I hope that has been informative and everything I've said has made sense. If anyone has any questions, please either just comment below or contact the office and they'll be able to put you in touch with me. Thanks very much.